everyone, from whatever time zone you're watching. I'd like to have say a few things before I start. One is that if you feel comfortable turning on the camera for yourselves, then I'd be very happy. It really helps me to be able to see people's faces, although I know it's in some way easier not to have the camera on. I do sympathize with that, but it's up to you. The other thing is, the important thing is that for this course, it's important to bring a chumash with you every time. In other words, the basic sources, the primary sources from the Torah will not be on the source pages. And so I'm depending on your having a chumash, but I'll read out the quotations, and I hope it should go easily. You should have source sheets, which perhaps I hope you've printed up. And
I'll also put the source sheets down on the chat below for anyone who hasn't been able to get it before.
Great. And I will just refer to the number of the source sheet. I won't screen share. That makes things a little simpler for me. What else did I want to tell you? Yes, that the shiur will be an hour and a half, not an hour and a quarter as was advertised. So bear that in mind. We hope to finish at 1:15, right? And I think with that, we can start. Trauma and healing. I'm not sure why I gave that title to this series on Parshat Hashavua. I've been teaching Parshat Hashavua for many, many years. It's one of the miracles of my life. It's one of the most amazing things that has been given to me, to keep on revisiting week by week the drama, the unfolding drama of the Torah, from the point of view of time. That is, every week, regardless of what you're going through in that week, we revisit, this week, Parshat Noach. And there's a certain significance that is set up then, whether we like it or not, whether we have live imaginations or not such live imaginations. We can't help looking in the Parsha of the week, in that section of the Torah, for some indication of an address to what we are going through now, that in some way it should speak to us. It's a subjective reading of the Torah, which of course is one of the classic ways of reading Torah. We don't read it only objectively. And so trauma and healing, of course, has specific meaning for all of us, the whole world, at this moment of our history. And I don't have to elaborate. And in many points, when I go through my material, the analogies will be obvious, and I won't say them. Right? I'll leave it up to you to make the applications. I want to somehow bring together the eternal and the specific meanings of the text. Now we begin, and it's always a little bit of an irony, we begin, God creates the world and then he destroys the world, right? Those are the two great movements, the paradox of God's first movement into the world. He creates the world, and then no time at all later, well, actually 10 generations, but what is that in the view of eternity? A mere 10 generations later, before mankind has basically got to its feet, he destroys the world. That is the ebb and tide, but it's a very dramatic, cataclysmic moment, the moment of destruction. Why does God see fit to uncreate the world? And one of the points I want to make is, at the beginning, is that the way God chooses to destroy the world is to destruct the world. Just in the same, using the same imagery and the same materials of creating the world, God then does the opposite. He created the world by dividing between the waters. Mavdil bein mayim lemayim. Yes, that's one of the early stages of creation. Before that, everything was one mass of water. So then there is the upper world waters and the lower waters. And what does God do? He drives a wedge between the two. He divides the two. It's called rakia, the firmament, whatever that means, the sky, I'm not sure. At any rate, all that essential stuff that stops the world from being a sheer mass of water. That's one of the earliest stages of creating form. That's what God is doing in creating form. That's one of the most important concepts that I want to hold on to as we go through our material. And instead of chaos, instead of amorphous mass of water, there is now a division. A division is dry land, among other things. And once you have dry land, that's a machai. Now we're talking. Now we can begin to talk. Now we can begin actually to structure things, to build things on the dry land. You can't build things on the sea. There've been many attempts to defeat the sea, to build artificial land masses in many places. In Toronto, very close to our world. There are very specific attempts to do that. The sea, in that sense, is an enemy. Of course, there's much good that comes of the sea, and we want to talk about that. But part of the process of creation is controlling the sea, placing limits to the sea. Now we have forms, we have dry land, and we can have everything that we recognize as a civilized world, including certain wild bits still left in the world, untamed pieces left in the world, perhaps specifically left in the world. There are jungles, there are deserts, yes? Midrash likes to talk about that. So we now have a created world. And then there are the other distinctions and divisions that God goes about making, separating light from darkness, separating day from night, separating different kinds of animals, defining them, naming them. That is what it means to create. So that you have separate forms, shapes, that can be distinguished from each other and that can begin to enter into a drama with each other. What does God do when he wants to destroy the world? He simply lets the lower waters, the Tehom, call my gods Tehom, when one of the early descriptions of the flood. It's in chapter 7, verse 11, yes, if you want to look it up, is Nifku'u kol mayanot Tehom rabah. All the fountains of the great deep. Just think of the contained energy there. They're fountains. There's pressure being held on those fountains to keep them up, keep them down. They're geysers, yes? Have you ever been in Geezerland? Have you ever been in New Zealand? That's the world in which you better watch your step, because you tread on forbidden territory and the geysers are right under your feet. It's very dangerous. And so those geysers broke through Nifku from beneath, and also niftachu kol arubot hashamayim. Arubot hashamayim niftachu. And also the windows of the heaven opened up and the rain came bucketing down from up above. So what you have then is from above and below a reunion of the waters. And it isn't just a matter of a good heavy rain, forget about it. When the rain fell a couple of days ago, I was convinced that this was because I was thinking about the subject so much. Now, it's not just that. That's Gishmei Bracha. If it's not too much of it, then we call it the rain of blessing. But this is from both ends, from above and from below, and leaving no space for anything solid, for anything substantial, for anything that has form in it. What about the creation of man? Again, I'm just going to gesture at one or two examples of what I'm talking about. It's almost, what I'm thinking about here is the account of creation and destruction, both of them, as examples of what I want to call the material imagination. The imagination that's being called out in us is not abstract here. It's not, the glory of the human mind, at least not obviously. It's things. Is it possible for things made of chemical elements to exist? Too much water, flooding water, which infiltrates solid objects. It's not just looking out, but it's looking internally. If you get too much water inside you, it decomposes you. All the solid fibers that hold you together. I don't want to get too graphic. I did it in a previous class and regretted it because it was too macabre an image. I don't want to make you feel too much worse in the course of this meeting. But that one of the ways in which one decomposes, bodies decompose, is because of liquid. is because of, I don't have to go into too great detail there, right? And here, when God says, Emche et ha'adam, right, somewhere between creation and destruction, at the end of last week's parsha, if you have a chumash, have a look at it. It's chapter 6, verse 6, or verse 5, actually. We can start from verse 5. Vayar Hashem, and God saw that great was the evil of the human being on the earth. Rabba ra'at ha'adam ba'aretz. So it's a focus on the human being on the earth. There's an attachment between earth, solid substance, and the human being who is made of earth, after all. We can't forget that, even though it's not emphasized here, because the word is aretz, not adamah. Yeah, so it's not hammered home, but we can't help thinking of it. V'chol yetzer machshavot libo rak ra kol hayom. What's wrong with this man? Not his body, but yetzer libo, the creativity of his heart. That's what yetzer is, not the yetzer hara yet. We're not specifically talking about the evil inclination. That will be a product, a concept that comes from this. But what is it? It's fantasy. What is the human heart doing all day long? It's fabricating destructive fantasies. And anything bad that people are doing is only a product of what goes on in the heart. Or you want to call it the imagination or fantasy. Yeah, but that realm, it's called Leva Adam. Vayinachem Hashem ki asa et ha'adam ba'aretz. One of the saddest, most traumatic words. And God regretted, Vayinachem. He changed his mind. Rashi will say, machshava acheret. He thought at one time it was a good idea to create the human being, and he put into place all those processes, those chemical processes, the separations and the creation of solid substance and so on. And now he unrolls his creation because he now has another thought. He has a different view on his previous thought. The idea that God changes his mind is, of course, disturbing. Of course, equally, of course, we are familiar with it, because later it'll be used quite often when it comes to God changing his mind about destroying the Israelites after the golden calf, when it comes to the story of Nineveh, of Jonah and Nineveh, and in many other places. God intends at one moment doom and destruction, and then he changes his mind either for the good or for the bad. It can go either way. Here it's clearly for the bad, that now creation was a bad idea, God thinks. Let's do destruction instead. And so what we read then is Vayinachem, he changes his mind. I thought Vayinachem meant he was comforted. Isn't that the usual meaning of the word? Nechama, to be comforted. But here it has a different meaning. And Rashi says, don't trust the obvious meanings of the words. The obvious meanings of the words are reductions on some level. Simplifications are always reductions. What else is there in the word nechama that's not just comfort? It's simply the idea of an alternative way of thinking. Whatever you thought before, here is another way of thinking. Now, again, surely God contains all thoughts. He knows everything at all moments. So how can he be understood as someone who regrets an idea that he had before? Right? It's extremely, what's the word we use? Anthropomorphic. Yeah, that's our word that we use when we want to describe a description of God in the Torah, for instance, that makes us uneasy. The biggest, well, I should be afraid of generalizations. One of the biggest focuses for anthropomorphism is this Parsha. This Parsha and last week's Parsha, creation and destruction. We are given the contents of God's mind as if it's a human mind. Almost embarrassingly, I would say. It's not just Vayinachem. Another thing Rashi says here is Nimlach. He asked himself. He became a subject who is wondering what to do about man. So here is God unsure, hesitant. That's Vayinachem. He is in some way ambivalent. Now that is anthropomorphism. Human beings know about ambivalence. I would almost say it's a constitutive description of the human being. Who are we? We are the creatures that are capable of ambivalence. The animal is not capable of ambivalence. The animal never has two thoughts at the same time, at least as far as we know. But that is a complexity of thought, a dynamic movement of thought. That's something that human beings have. Surely it's not politically correct, theologically correct, to say that God has that kind of dynamic. And yet he does, clearly. He says at one moment he'll destroy, and then he decides not to destroy. He creates at one moment, and then he decides not to create. And Rashi actually uses that expression, nimlach. He asked counsel. Of whom? Well, of himself, maybe. That there are two thoughts there at the same time. He doesn't know quite what to do. Similarly, there's a very difficult pasuk just before this passage, when Hashem says, this is Perek Vav, pasuk Gimel, chapter 6, verse 3. Hashem says, looking at the evil of human beings, a particular outrageous story that we don't really understand, Vayomer Hashem, God said to himself, presumably, Lo yadon ruchi ba'adam la'olam. What does that mean? My mind, my spirit will not go on judging man forever? What does that mean? It's dismaying in the way it blocks us. What? We're not going to go up. My spirit is not going. And Rashi, again, gives a very interesting translation. And he says, Lo yiruchi lo yitraem v'yariv ma la'asot im ha'adam. I'm astonished myself, even though I've been thinking about this hard. That is, that God says, I'm not going to continue this terrible conflict in myself, what to do about man. Man is the creature of all my creatures who has the power to throw me into deep conflict, radical conflict. Im lahashchit, im lerachem. That's the way it's put. Whether to destroy or whether to have mercy. That is, we are introduced to God at this point, just before destruction, at a moment when he hasn't quite decided yet. Why do we need to know that God has such phases? Surely we like to think of God as different from us, in a sense that he knows what he we do, so that we can have an intuition about what I can do in my relationship with God, right? I can have a certain empathy for God. Can I put it that way? The great Hasidic rabbis, one of the things that they were most moving, and they talked about really having Rachmanis on God, that they had compassion for God. They thought to themselves, how much God must be suffering at a particularly bad time. As if God, on some level, we have to forget about the fact that he is omnipotent. It doesn't serve us sometimes to think that he's omnipotent. It's much better to think of him as somehow like us, that he is like us or we are like him. I'm not sure which way around it is. After all, God declared when he created the human being that he is B'Tselem Elokim. B'Tselem uvidmut, two words. And there's a lot of discussion for the form, the image. Whatever it is, it seems to suggest something about the actual shape of the human being. The shape of his body, or the shape of his character, the shape of his... Something about the meaning of the human being is like God. Demut and Selem are rather solid. And I want to suggest something different. And that is that the human being is like God, or God is like the human being, not in the completed shape, but in the process by which, for instance, the human being changes. The human being lives from moment to moment, what's called the flow of consciousness, that consciousness is not a solid thing, that we have one thought at one moment and immediately there's another thought and another thought. And one of the ways in which one can begin to work on oneself, the work on ourselves to make ourselves perhaps more like that Selim, that ideal image of God, is to work the material, right? In the sense that you work material like clay, like God did at the beginning. God took the dust of the earth, it sounds like dry dust, and he formed him into that creature. So that Selim is the form. What is really more deeply, more profoundly like God about us? That God is like us, whichever way, I'm not sure yet exactly how to say it. Maybe it works both ways. It's the fact of the dynamic work that can be done by the human being to change his own form. And that is what God models for us, in a sense. When God is at, the text allows us to witness him changing, actually. And really invites us not to be rigid about it, not to immediately spring to the defense of God and say, oh, but God is eternal and all-knowing and unchanging and all the things that philosophers say. Right? This is not a philosophical tract. This is a poetic tract. I would almost say that it's a theological tract in a different sense. And it's a psychoanalytic tract. That is, it has to do with the way in which the mind, in its depth, not just at its surface, works. Not just the shape and the form, but the actual material. When you get your hands into the clay. Was man created from dry dust? So Rashi comments on the text here that we have just read, when God decides limchot et Adam, to wipe out, to annihilate the human being. Vayomer Hashem, chapter 6, verse 7. We're going back to that passage. God said, let me emche et Adam, let me wipe out. Well, it's not a very good translation. Annihilate the human being whom I've created on the surface of the earth, of the soil, Adamah. Right, that's where the man was created from. Let me wipe him out. And what does Rashi say about that? I don't think I have it on your page yet. We will get to the page. Who he is made of earth. I will add water to him. I will simply mix him with water, a lot of water, till he completely decomposes. That's all I have to do. He had form, and I am going to bring floods of water upon him. And here's a kind of almost like a chemistry lab. What does it matter? We have to think now in terms of materials and elements. What is man made of? He's made of dust, and God will add lots of water and make a paste, which then becomes just nothing. And that's what the word, which is used several times in the flood, means. The word limchot. God then annihilated through water all forms in the world, not just the human being, but all the animals. And Ramban makes a big point of it. It's not just that they all died, but they all fell apart, that nothing was left of the form of any creature. So there is that sense of a world returned to primal chaos. It goes back to before form making. Right? We're going right back, we're deconstructing. We're going right back to the beginning. Who is in trauma about this process? Clearly, at this point, it's God. Vayit atsev el libo. And he was saddened to his heart. Now, I can never push past that. When I'm preparing the parsha, when I read it, it's like I want to carry on, but I have to stop. Vayit atsev, the pathos of God. How many times does the Torah ask us to share in the pain and the suffering of God? Well, if I think of anthropomorphisms, certainly anger, I have to say. Anger is something that the Torah is not inhibited about describing God. That's certainly a term, that God experiences anger. All right. In a way, I can understand that. that God is the father figure who is angry with his children. It's an image that in some way befits the anger of the gods. There is even such an expression, the anger of the gods, but that God is saddened to his heart. The sense of deep, right? Not just I'm a God and therefore I'm dissatisfied with you, but deep pain. And I want to emphasize depth here, that goes into the depths of his heart. God has a heart, and he is saddened to his heart. And again, one interpretation that Rashi offers unexpectedly is, and that brings him into a deep connection with the human heart, which is only evil all day long. That's the next description. So God is not just judging from above. He wouldn't have to be sad then. You'd give him a certain satisfaction of his anger, but actually identified with the human heart. There's some deep identification there. And he is saddened. What does it mean to be saddened? Before I go on, I just want to add one point about water. The destructive, chaos-reducing element that takes solid objects and forms and meanings and reduces them to absolute nothingness. So that you wouldn't even know that anything had a name, that anything had a shape beforehand. Ramban writes very eloquently about that. But Rashi says he is made of dust, and all I have to do is dissolve him in a lot of water. He ignores, maybe because of his purposes here, the fact that Adam was not created of dry dust. You may remember, and we'll look at this source again later, that when God created Vayitzer, he formed man from the dust. He didn't do that until rain had fallen from heaven. And it was only then that it was possible, using the rain to wet and soften the earth and to make it formable, like clay, that man could be created. And there is a story, thereby hangs a tale, an extraordinary midrashic tale, which I hope to get to in a few minutes, about how all the vegetation that was supposed to grow on the surface of the earth somehow had failed to come through. Comes to the sixth day, before the sixth day, there was no human being on the earth, and there was no vegetation. Even though God had already commanded on the third day, let the earth bring forth vegetation. Tatsheh haaretz deshe. So if God said it and it says it happened, then why didn't it happen? Why don't we see vegetation? And the answer that is given, so again, a very physical answer. It has to do with processes of growth and what happens when you plant a garden. You bring into play your knowledge of the earth and the world. It grew, the vegetation did grow, trees, everything that should sprout from the earth. It did grow, but only up to the surface of the earth. It didn't break through the surface. It didn't actually enter into the world of visible forms. It was still there, potential, under the earth. Why not? Why not? Have a look at Rashi. Since we brought it up, I don't seem to be able to. Number 6 on your source page. Why not? Because it was not yet time. Adayin lo. Terem yeh ba'aretz. All the vegetation was not yet on the earth. Why not? Because, it says, because Adam ayin la'avodat adamah. There was no human being, and there was no rain. Now, which is it? There was no rain. I can understand physically. If there was no rain, then no, that's clearly needed. But the idea here is that there's no human being. If you have a look at this passage, towards the end of number 6, I hope to come back to it. Why was there no rain? The last couple of lines. Lefi she'adam en la'avodat adamah. Because there was no human being to till the soil. That's one level of meaning. And that means to work, la'avod, to work on the material that exists, to make something of it. What kind of work? Spiritual work, inner work. There was no human being who was capable of recognizing the goodness of the rain. That is, who has an imagination, who had a creative ability and look at the dry surface of the earth and know that rain is necessary. Something is necessary to moisten the earth for vegetation to grow. And that, in brief, in spiritual terms, means that there was no human being to pray, l'espalel, to actually use his force of desire and his force of imagination to look at what's not there and to try to bring it into being within the limits of what a human being can achieve. Can I ask you to mute yourselves? Make sure that you're muted. Thank you. So it's not just physically tilling the earth, it's avodah in Rashi's reading. That is to look at a lacking state of affairs, a deficient state of affairs. Something's wrong here. Creation has been stalled. God said it should bring forth, and it didn't bring forth. Sometimes God's creative will actually is stalled. Creation doesn't do exactly what God said it should do. It does it potentially up to a certain point, but then the rest is left to human imagination, to the human being who's also a creator, and who sees then with something godlike faculty what's needed here. And he prays, and once he prays, once he's discovered the art of prayer, it's a new genre, it's a new way of dealing with the world, then that's when the vegetation sprouts. So that when God forms man, to come back to our original point, it's from a mixture of earth and water. It's not just earth. So it's the mixture is creative. Once you've got a mixture, it's soft enough for you combined the elements of earth and water, then you know you can work with it, right? A Play-Doh or whatever. The different textures that you can have when you're working with materials, getting your fingers into them, the hand, the creative hand. And here, I want to say that the creative hand is an instrument of power and of great sadness and disappointment. We feel very powerful when our hand has succeeded in producing what we are dreaming of. Right? I dream of a certain poem. There's a poem taking shape inside me. There's a shir taking shape inside me. I'm trying to get somewhere. I'm trying to get somewhere which I don't have in my hands. I don't have it. In case you're under any illusions, I have many pages of notes, but I'm working with the material, and it's very hard work, and it takes a lot of courage because it's uncertain. Because here I am in the open. And the idea would be that if what I get in the end is really disappointing, is really outrageous, then etatzev libi. Then there will be that particular kind of sadness that God feels. How does Rashi put it? Nit abel alovdan maaseh yadav. He was mourning for the loss of the work of his hands. In other words, this is God as the creator, almost literally as someone who was formed out of clay, the human being, and breathed life into the human being. That's an image for creation of a humankind as well. Right? That's what we hope to do. We hope to take words or clay or movements in dance, yes, or the ingredients of a cake. It's all the same thing, or a human relationship. We want to take the elements and hope that life will be breathed into it. What happens if it doesn't work? All right, so we throw that one out. We throw that draft of the poem with some pain. What is the cost of creativity when it doesn't work? When the hands have worked in vain? They have used their power and it didn't come out well. Have a quick look with me now at the beginning, the opening sources on your source page. Number 1 has 4 parts to it. And these are Rashi's commentary on 4 times that the word itzavon is used in the creation and flood stories. The idea of sadness, itzavon vayit atzev. Now I want to just look at them very quickly, although each one is very interesting. The first one, number 1, is God saying that to the woman in the Garden of Eden, in the curse, in the section when man and woman are being cursed, God says, Harba arbe et itzponech. I will greatly increase your itzavon. Doesn't sound good. Veheronech be'etzef tel dibanim. So your pain and your pregnancy and three things, and the pain in pain you will give birth to children. And what Rashi says here is very clear. You think this is all referring to the pain of childbirth. No. Everything but etzponech refers to the pain of childbirth, the pain of pregnancy, the discomfort of pregnancy, the physical things. But the real pain, the real grief is etzponech. And what does Rashi say about that? Ze tsar gidul banim. That is the, how should we say, the built-in, the inherent difficulty of raising children. Now, difficulty is it's a euphemism for tsar. I remember before I had children, and I regarded myself, of course, as no trouble at all to my parents. I thought, well, what could be the pain of raising children? It's just lovely. What's wrong with that? And of course, it is just lovely. There are moments of sheer bliss. I'm not denying that. There is also the drama of the real life of working with a human being, with live material, with material that has a will of its own, that makes up its own mind what kind of child it's going to be. Right? From the beginning, this little scrap, in the first days of life, has unconscious intentions. Somewhere there's material, there's something seething there in the mud. Call it the Yetzer Hara, the Yetzer Hatov, desires, libidos, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't get better with the passage of the years, right? It just changes, right? The child becomes more conscious, more capable of disciplining him or herself, but can also make very radical decisions that we don't like as parents. There is that. And that's called itzbonech, as if it's part of the territory. In a way, you shouldn't be so surprised and so disappointed when it happens, because that's the way it is with creativity, that the material decides for itself what it's going to be. There is something in that. And so God too experiences it when he sees that everything's gone wrong. Similarly, in the next passage, about the curse on the ground. What kind of curse is it to say, you shall eat of the grass of the field? After all, it's also a blessing. Look, I gave you all the grass of the field that brings forth seed. That was said not as a curse, but as actually a beneficent gift to human beings, that they would be able to use vegetables, let's say. They'd be able to make a plant meal, a meal out of healthful plants. What's the curse in that? And so Rashi then says, no, but look at the rest of the verse. Cursed be the ground because of you, in your imagination, in your inner world. It's not the ground is cursed, but you will feel somewhere cursed in your relationship to the soil. Why? When? B'itzavon tochalena. You will eat it in itzavon. Eat the food in itzavon. What does that mean? Kotz v'dardar tatzmiach lecha. That the earth will give you thorns and thistles when you have planted all kinds of good, healthy vegetables. Right? If you've ever been busy with the work of the hands in the earth, of planting stuff, and you have, with great discrimination and great care and great hard work, chosen your seeds and put the seeds in the ground and dreamed the result, you can just see those tomatoes coming up. And then suddenly what you get is thorns and thistles instead. The earth speaks back to you, right? You're working with the earth, and the earth has another intention. Somewhere all your efforts are doomed to waste. And that is one of the basic human experiences since the Garden of Eden. Again, it goes with the territory of creating. As soon as you begin working on something that's outside yourself and investing yourself in what's outside yourself, yeah, it becomes a positive insult. It's a positive slap in the face when what you're creating doesn't work well, because it's not just an outside thing. And that's how God feels, right? When it says in the end there, Vayitatsev libo, look at the last passage. Then Rashi says this is Rashi's understanding consistently of what it means to talk about itzavon as opposed to just etzev. It has to do with creativity. Nit abel al ovdan ma'aseh. God mourned, it's the work of mourning. He mourned for the loss of the work of his hands. God had the appropriate reaction. And it's an important human reaction when things go wrong. Freud made a great deal of it, the work of mourning. If you are prevented for some reason from mourning, then all the processes of life get blocked. I'm going to come back to that a bit later. Mourning.
I don't hear well. And it's not as high as when it's without.
I'm sorry? I don't, can you mute yourselves, please? I'll try to make some time for questions at the end, and I will look at someone's writing here that the sound is very poor. Is that so? Is the sound very poor?
got better, Avivah. It's okay. You can continue.
It's okay?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry. I hate the feeling that you can't hear me clearly.
I found it helpful to reduce the volume on the computer, and it got better.
For whom? For me or for the audience?
You're quieter, but there's no choppiness anymore.
Okay.
Oh, Avivah, you stay the way you are speaking.
Okay. A moment. Yes. Okay. Is that any better? No. Okay. Well, I'll do my best, and then we'll see. Thank you. Okay. So God is mourning his creativity. This is before everything has been destroyed. It's not that he's mourning physical loss yet. He's mourning the loss of a concept, of his fantasy, of his reverie. He had an intention. Vayomer vayehi. He said, and it was. That's the dream of the creator. That's how we know. That's what we know when we create. And it's true of God too. And here he's lost it. And that process of acknowledging loss is part of the story. That's part of the story. Noach, if you look at number 3, 1c, right, the third passage in number 1, when Noach is born, his father names him Noach, saying, Ze yenachamenu mima'asenu u'mi'itzvon yadenu. This one will give us relief, Rashi translates, yaniach mimenu, not comfort. Again, the word for comfort is played with here. It's as if I know that Yenachamenu means he will comfort us, this child will comfort us, but it can't mean that because he's named Noach. And the two words don't go together. If it's Noach, it's not Menachem. So if he's named Noach, it must come from the root Noach. So you say Yenachamenu, you split into two words and you say Yaniach Mimenu. Now this messing around with words, excuse the expression, that's part of the creative activity that goes into speaking, that goes into writing. And here you have a biblical text that's inviting us to play, that's saying there isn't only one solid given meaning of the word Yenachamenu. It has to do with the hope that the Father has, that the Son will give them relief from the anguish, the difficulty of creative work. It's von yadenu, the built-in frustration of the power of our hands, the hands' power to create things. And the specific suggestion of Rashi is quite startling and very interesting, that before the days of Noach, there had been no plow yet. Yes, but he invented the plow. So suddenly you have a very specific technological advance that the Midrash wants to assign to Noach. That from now on, the hands don't have to do all the work. getting into the soil. And here you have to imagine it. It's a tactile image. And, you have to really get into it, yes. Get your hands dirty, yeah? In imagination at least. That's what it means to work. That's what it means to produce things. You can't just smooth over the surface of a beautiful statue and say, isn't it lovely? That really a better image is not the statue that is chiseled, but something that's made of clay or earth. It's earthy stuff. It comes from underneath, and you get your hands into it and you try to make it produce. You try to make it to create a form. Till now, that's been very difficult because the hands have had to do all the work. And now we have an extension of our hands. Right? Isn't that what all technology is, in a very loose sense? That now the hands become much stronger, more resistant to the resistance of the earth and the stones and the thorns and the thistles. Now we can be ruthless as power. When you have a plow, you have much more power than you had with the mere hand. Right? So it's a tremendous help. But basically, it's still the action of the hands. Right? That is the concept, that our hands are at work. And then you have all kinds of wonderful replacements for the hand. A baseball mitt, yeah. Right now you have the force, you have the ability to resist the force of the baseball. Right, so suddenly your hand becomes much more powerful because it can right, because you have a mitt on it. Right? Elaine Scarry is a contemporary philosopher who talks about this kind of thing at great length, and she gives a number of examples of the power of the hand that is extended. So through technology, for instance, an asbestos glove. I like these examples. Once we can put on an asbestos glove to handle the hot oven, the hot pots, whatever, then suddenly our hand has become more powerful. And what we look for is the extension of the power of the hand. Somewhere, that's our creative ability. But what happens when that is disappointed? So we try to look for better implements of power. Is that the only way to go? Other than the hand of power, is there any other kind of hand? Is there any other way of creating in the world? And when we talk about the plow, we're talking about another way of creating. Because what does the plow do? The plow gets deep down into the material, into the matter. No form at all. Into the soil, down below, underneath, hidden, and turns everything over, so that what was on top is down below and what is below is now on top. So really transfigures the whole surface of the earth. That's what a plow does. And that is a different way of using the hand. It opens up a different way of using the hand. Have a look now at the idea then of what the plow means. If Noah is going to invent the plow, what is that going to mean symbolically? What kind of dream does that make real? Notice in the number 3 that when God destroys Adam et haaretz, with the earth, et haaretz. And Rashi there says it could mean from the earth, that he destroys the human being from the face of the earth. That is one possibility. But then the next line, davar acher. But another possibility, he's not satisfied with that. It's that et haaretz means with the earth, that when man was destroyed, the earth too was destroyed. How much of the earth, right? Was all earth destroyed? No. Just the effective depth of the earth that is reached by the plow. It's very specific, the description there. 3 hands' breadths deep into the soil is as far as the plow, perhaps of that time, could reach. And that is washed away in the flood. Together is decomposed. In other words, the flood is an anti-plow. It goes against the creative power of the plow to make use of a situation in which there's just old dry soil on top and good wet undersoil, and somehow is the capacity for turning things over. Now have a look at number 4. And we see what this power of creativity, what are the images for it? Number 4. אמר רבי יצחק, למה נמשלה תפילתן של צדיקים כאתר? Why are the prayers of the righteous. Now, suddenly we're back to prayer here. That there's something about a real prayer. That's the prayers of the righteous, an effective prayer. Why should prayer be effective? What power does prayer have? It's words, after all. Right? It's words. That's going to budge reality. That's going to budge the facts of the matter. What is it compared to? It's compared to a plow, ka'atar. The source of this idea is, again, a play on words. The Midrash wants us to extend our imagination. The word vaye'etar is a word for prayer, and it's used of whom? Vaye'etar Yitzchak lenochach ishto. When Isaac prays for his barren wife, because he wants her to be able to have children, that's the word that's used for prayer, vaye'etar. And we usually understand it as intense prayer, pressure, putting pressure on God, as it were. It's not a light prayer. But here the Rashi, the Midrash, says, what is that word atar? It's a play on words. It also means a plow. So prayer is a plow and a plow is prayer. What's in common between the two? That's a metaphor. Right? That's how metaphors work. They take two things that are not the same, that are incongruous, prayer and plow. What are you talking about? And they find that electric place where putting the two together creates a spark. And suddenly you see prayer differently. You understand prayer differently. It's not just an abstraction anymore. As the Midrash says here, just as this plow turns over the produce from one position to another position, makom le makom. The word makom is a very, very powerful word. The context, right? From one context to another, right? One gains great life from context. Here I am in this context now, and here I am shut in the house most of the days of my life, a lot of the time, and so on and so on. I said I wasn't going to be morbid in an actual sense. What do I have at my disposal to change my context? To say that I exist also in other contexts, not only in the physical reality of my closed-in life. What is it that allows me to be outside as well as inside? Well, here I'd have to say a good word for Zoom, but I have mixed feelings about Zoom. In any case, let's go back to the plow. The plow shifts things from one place to another. So the prayers of the righteous shift God's attributes from the attribute of anger to the attribute of compassion. And they rhyme with each other, ragzanut and rachmanut. The usual expression is din and rachamim, from the attribute of strict justice and the attribute of compassion. But here it's called ragzanut, anger. Let's say it like it is. God doesn't know whether to be angry or whether to be compassionate. He seems to have opted for anger, and that's on top. That's the topsoil. The prayer of the righteous can reach in underneath into the depths of God's being, into the unconscious. I want to say what I want to say, but I don't want to say it too clearly yet. I want to leave space for the mind, for you to go many places in your thoughts, to reach in. What do we do when we appeal to someone's compassion when he's in an angry state? All he knows at this point is that he's angry. Consciously, that's all he is. But somewhere lurking underneath is good, rich, deep undersoil of love and compassion, which he's not aware of at this moment, because that's not the context at the moment. And then you appeal to this person and you arouse that deep thing that's underneath, and suddenly you become more aware of it. It comes up to the surface. That's what a human being can do for God. Now, it's a very physical description. The plow is a very material thing. Yeah? And it means going into substance, not form. Leave form out of it now. It's a question really of a form that you are trying to bury in the earth, and another possibility, a potential that you're trying to bring up to the surface. if this were a real class, I could really, if you were here physically in front of me, I would have a much better idea if you were with me or not. So this is part of my suffering in the time of Corona, that I can't really have that idea, but some of you are being very encouraging. Thank you. So that's the problem that the Plow prayer can face. The Russian poet Mandelstam has a passage that I always like to quote, where he says that poetry, he doesn't talk about prayer, right? He was a Russian materialist. He talks about poetry, which he is perhaps the greatest poet of the 20th century. I mean, one doesn't like to give grades, but so I understand. He says poetry is like a plow, and he actually describes the activity of the plow. How does he put it? He says this: poetry is the plow tearing open and turning over time, so that the deep layers of it, its rich black undersoil, ends up on the surface. That's a description. Mankind craves, like a plowman, for the virgin soil of time. That is, the poet doesn't want to be stuck on the world of the surface, of the way language is used now at the present moment. Right? The way it's misused, the way the crusted way it is, because it's overused, right? It's just become lifeless. And he wants to reach down into the past in this case and bring up the language of the past and bring it back to life by putting it on top where it can produce. Now that's one specific idea of what it means to renew by burying, to renew by destroying in a way, by coming in there, chewing up the surface, down. Darwin had a similar idea, and I'm going to say this very briefly, even though I love this material. I think it's very eloquent. Darwin, aside from the origin of the species, had another issue that he was very interested in, and that is the activity of worms, earthworms, in creating the rich topsoil that you can find in fields over the course of time. And he estimates, he actually gives us figures on this. He says, for instance, over 8 years, he has witnessed 2 to 3 inches depth of new soil. How were they created? By the worms consuming and excreting. In other words, the lowly worm, lowly in every sense, right? Even in the ich sense, you know, what is a worm after all? Rima v'tolea, right? It's awful stuff. Has to do with death, but there is the ambivalence about the worm. The worm is not just death, it's also a humble producer of life. The worms are the unsung heroes of hope for the world, because the worms get in there and they bring good stuff up to the top. And Darwin says they are the natural plows. Before there were plows, we had worms, and the worms are still active. He talks about up to 18 tons of rich soil cover 1 acre of ground because of 50,000 worms that are there within 1 acre. Right? Obviously, he's done his science, his figures here, that somewhere there is this tremendous amount of small activity, of tiny molecular activity going on under the surface, hidden, that in the end, it brings life. So however worried one is about the extinction of the species on the grand scale, there is always the worm. And Darwin wrote about this at the beginning of his career, and then in his last book, again, he wrote about it again as a fruit of his life, and it was his most popular book in his own time. That was the book that everyone liked, for obvious reasons. What do we have? Al tiri tolat Yaakov. From Yeshayahu, don't be afraid, O worm of Yaakov. That doesn't sound like much of a compliment. The prophet compares us to a worm. And Rashi comments, I think it's Rashi, comments there. The thing about the worm is, Ein kocho ela bapeh. that the power of the worm is only in its mouth, which is just what we're saying, right? In a very material way, if you think of the innards of things, going down into the depths of things, the almost disgusting innards of things. It's the innards, the digestive system of the worm, which starts with the mouth, with taking stuff in and then excreting. So the mouth is the source of the creativity of the worm. And Israel, its mouth, in a different sense, its verbal abilities, right? We have the capacity to use our mouths, and that's our whole koch, that's our whole strength. Use our mouths to turn things over, to transform things, to displace things. Now, this is a question of imagination as much as anything. Turn it over and turn it over. It's not only prayer, it's study of Torah. Yeah? Turn it over and turn it over, for everything is in it. We're told. We're not told to study Torah. That sounds almost a little superficial. No, get down into the depths of it. Get beyond the obvious. Get beyond the one simple reductive thing that you consciously know about, and listen to the ambivalences. Listen to the whole range of possibilities. You love it and you hate it. And be aware of that there are many things, perhaps everything that's important to us, we both love and hate. The dirt in the ground, right? The worms, right? It's not lovable material, but it can become part of a dream of creativity. Somewhere it can also be used as an image for something positive, for something hopeful. Does Noah pray at all? And here, in the time we have left, I want to close in on the story of the flood. Here is Noah, set adrift in a box without oars, no possibility physically of navigating in this completely encompassing flood of water. What you have in that is a little box, well sealed in all kinds of ways, with its sohar, with a little window of some kind at the top, and a door that was closed firmly once he and his select survivors, his family and specimens of the animals, had entered inside. By Yisgor Hashem ba'ado, God closed it firmly upon him. And that's where he spends a year, in a dry environment, alone. He and his family, alone human beings, in a mass of animals of all kinds. And what is he busy doing during that time? There is no word that Noah speaks, right? His mouth doesn't seem to have any koach at all. Instead, he's feeding the animals. Now, that's an important job that he's doing. And the Midrash, in different forms, gives us descriptions of how self-denying he is, that he's not looking to gratify himself, but he spends his whole day and his whole night running around and feeding the animals, each one at the time that he likes to be fed. In other words, there is no specifically human time. There's no night and day. There's no summer and winter. Right? The external signs of change are not there. Here he is isolated in this capsule. He has no idea what the season is, what the light is, what his wish for time is. He gives up his wishes to the animals, and he goes around whenever anyone wants to eat. That's when he feeds them. This is the same Noah who said nothing when God told him to go and shut himself up with his family in a box and let the rest of the world perish, turn to water. And here there is an ambivalence. Right? The classic way of studying this, of reading this, is that Noah was a tzaddik. It says he's a tzaddik, actually. He's a perfectly righteous person. Tzaddik tamim. So there is the side of us that likes that. There is the side of the reader that says, yes, oh, that's great. Now I know he's a tzaddik tamim. Right there, he is fully created for me from the beginning of the story. I don't have to worry about him. I don't have to ask myself anything about him. Tzaddik tamim. So everything he does is just the way it should be. And when it says, for instance, Vaya'as Noach k'chol asher tzivah oto Elokim, Noah did exactly as God commanded him. That's simply a way of praising him. Right? That's to his credit, that he was obedient. Yes, that's obvious, no? Well, it's not obvious, for instance, to the Zohar. And the Zohar has a view of Noach that sees what's missing in Noach, that in a sense mourns Noach and says Noach could have done so much more. Where were his words? Where was his mouth? Where was his capacity to transform, to pray in a simple word, to transform God's clear decision? All right, God said, it's true, it's very clear and unequivocal. God said, Ketz kol basar ba lefanai. The end of all flesh has come before me. That means almost as if God is saying, I have no choice anymore. The thing has been determined. There is no longer any possibility. If God says that to a human being, it's not very encouraging. So maybe Noach is right, simply to give up from the start, not to try to pray. But the Zohar is dissatisfied. And the Zohar says, the part of me that doesn't like Noach so much. Noach represents a negative pole. There's something positive about obedience and Sadiq Tamim and so on, but there's something negative as well because he doesn't open his mouth. He doesn't try to save the world. He has no sense that he has power. And it's the power to work from the inside, not just to shape things from the outside, but to work with the material of humanity, to go and talk to people, for instance, to try to warn them, to try to change them, to change God. Nothing of that. And the Zohar will compare this very eloquently with Abraham, with Sodom, and with Moshe. When God decided to destroy the Israelites, he said to Moshe, Va'ata hanichali, just let me alone, and I'll destroy. That, when God said that to Moshe, it seemed like a clear instruction, don't interfere with me. My mind is set. No more ambivalence. And instead, Moshe responds by praying for the people. And the Zohar puts it like this. Moshe said to God, if I do as you say, then people will say that I destroyed the whole world like Noach. Do you hear the play on words? Hanichali. Just let me alone, God said. Really meaning, deep down what he meant was, don't let me alone. Moshe hears both. He hears the conscious level and he hears what God is implying. And he understands that the model for excessive obedience, for listening just to the surface, is Noach. That Noach listened just to the most obvious meaning of what God was saying, and God has really been challenging him. He's been, on the one hand, commanding him, but challenging him as well. All right, it's disturbing. We would like to have things clearer than that. But sometimes things are left to us too, that we have to use our own imagination, our own intuition. What is God really saying? Noach mi, hanichali. God is really challenging Moshe. You want to be like Noach? Then just don't interfere. You don't want to be like Noach? And Moshe hears that level of things. Now that ambivalence, right? Being able to think of two things at the same time. I love it and I hate it at the same time. It's on that level that our prayer lives and our dream lives are conducted. Dreams, reveries, if they're lively, if they really are powerful, they mean that they're getting right into the stuff of human consciousness and unconsciousness. That somewhere we're interested in things that are not just on the surface, in getting to a nice, clear form as fast as possible. That we're willing to allow for a certain chaos. It's the chaos of imagination, of giving some leeway for all the levels of ourselves, and of bringing things up from the depths, from those watery depths, so that something can be created. Of course, too much, too much eros, too much sheer desire to reshape the world infinitely, and there's too much water, and then there's a flood. It's called znut, right? The idea of promiscuous sexuality, which means that you're talking to everyone all over the place. By talking, I mean the language of sexuality. What does Noach opt for? He is put into a teva, in which there is no sexuality. One of the commandments for the Teva that God gives Noah is to separate from his wife, and the animals too will be separated by sex. And so what you will have is a sexless environment. None of that tension, of that kind of dibur, of opposites talking to each other and creating as a result. The strange thing is that if this was necessary as a antidote to the over-connectiveness of the world, which included all kinds of perversities and so on, according to Midrashic tradition. Nevertheless, have a look at your source page now. What can you find then if you look at number 7? Number 7. Noach is in the ark. God says to him at the end of the year, Say min hateva. He's a whole year there in the ark. Get out, emerge from the ark. Now, I'm putting great emphasis on the word say. This was a kind of end piece, two end pieces. At the beginning of the flood, God said, Bo el hateva, go into the ark, and we'll close the door on you. You'll be really enclosed in there. And then at the end, God said, leave the ark. So now have a look at what the Midrash makes of this. What this reminds the Chachamim here, the sages, of is a verse from Kohelet, from Ecclesiastes. There is a time for every object, Lakol's man, and the season for every desire, for every object under the heavens. There's a time for this and there's a time for that. That's how we deal, in a way, with ambivalence, with conflict. And somehow understanding in terms of time. So, for instance, there was a time for Noah to enter into the ark, right? In reaction against the promiscuity, right? The over-expressiveness, the perverse expressiveness of the world. He had to go into that box, bo ata. But there was a time for him to leave the ark. As it says, Tzei min hateva. But what happens, and here is the parable, it's like a governor, an administrator, who left his position, his place, his context again. And he settled someone else, he appointed someone else as a substitute for him. He is leaving, he's going away for a year, and he appoints someone else to occupy his position. When the administrator returned, he said to the replacement, leave your place. That is, leave my place, the place where I really belong. But I know you've got very comfortable in this place, and you now regard it as your place. You have to wrench yourself out of this closed place that I once told you to enter. And then if you go to the next line, this was Noach. When God said to him, leave the ark, lo kibel alav. He didn't accept. He wouldn't leave the ark. Now, there's no evidence of this on the surface of the text. It says he left. But look under what conditions he left. He left with his sons and his wife and the daughters, with the sexes separated. And from this, right, the unconscious level of this narrative then would be that we're talking about sexuality here. And that's the real subject. There was a time to enter the ark. That means separate from your wife, you and your sons, and the women's, males and females separate. And that's coded into the text. When it comes to leave, God says, leave you and your wife. Meaning, leave that artificial capsule of that ascetic place in which your language was irrelevant in a way, in which you were playing God. That's the point I'd like to make. That what is it that Noah doesn't want to leave? That he insists on staying in that closed place, and he leaves with not with his wife, but with his male sons, and he holds on to that separation that had been the rule of the teva. What did he have in the teva? Like God doesn't sleep. Noah doesn't sleep. God feeds the world, and God doesn't have sexual relations. In other words, God doesn't need to work. within the real stuff of human existence. God, from that point of view, God is the transcendent God, and he can simply administer to the world. He's not involved. And Noah had a position like that, which meant that he's not involved in human life, in the stuff. That was all right as far as God commanded it. But then God said, resume your vulnerable, risky situation as someone who wants to talk to his wife, as someone who wants to bridge gaps and make something good, create things from the soil from the stuff, the substance of existence. Return to that, and Noah is unaccountably or understandably reluctant to do it. Do we want to leave our closed rooms? Right? We very much want to leave our closed rooms. And there's something in us, perhaps, that doesn't want to leave. With all the sadness and with all the deprivation that we have, it's controllable. We don't, if we get used to it, then we don't, and this is a phenomenon that's been written about, that there are people who, even when things ease up a little bit, can't conceive of going out. Some kind of habit has been created now of making do with very little, of making do without the dangers of open talk, open meeting with people, starting up with people. Right? If you're all masked in each other's presence, that's one of the sufferings of our time. What is asked of us in that sense? What does Noah fail to get here in this understanding? What he fails to get is the need to take on the sense of mourning, to know that really there is a desire and I can't have what I want. I do want what I can't have at the moment, but I don't comfort myself by preventing I'm on the top of the world, by pretending that I'm on the top of the world. Oh, everything is just great. If I forget that actually I need to lose, I need to have the sense of having lost and mourning the loss, then I lose the capacity to desire. I lose the capacity to want more. And to want also is connected with praying. Praying comes from desire. Praying is saying to God, I want it otherwise. I want this. Acknowledging the reality. There is the reality, but nevertheless, on some level, I work with the material of reality. I get down deep there, and I keep the fantasies going. I keep something of desire going, the water. Otherwise, nothing can be created. So not on the literal level, then on other levels, right? So I write a poem instead of walking down the street and saying hello, with an open face to everybody. Yes. So somewhere there is an attempt, So I use the limitations of Zoom, even though I dislike it. There's nothing to say about that. That's I will not pretend I like it. I lose. And therefore there's something in me that prays to God. Even as I don't know what to pray. Have a look at the Sfatimet. Actually, number 8 and then number 9. We'll finish with this. Number 8. Vayidaber Elokim el Noach lemor tzei min hateva. God said to Noah, go out of the teva. In other words, spread your wings. Emerge. Right? The butterfly can begin to come back to life from that cramped situation. Begin to work again with the energies that have been held under. And suddenly here, the Chachamim bring into play another verse about being closed in. Hotzia mimasger nafshi lehodot et shemcha. This is from the book of Psalms, where the psalmist cries to God. It's a prayer. Release my life force, my nefesh, from imprisonment, masger, a closed situation, in order to give thanks to your name. And the Midrash now goes on to assume that Noach must have been praying this prayer, even though it's not mentioned anywhere in the text, even though there is this tradition about his being silent and in some way cramped. He doesn't dare to be a full human being. Something in him must all along have been crying, get me out of here. Get me out of here. And that's what God's response to it then is, say, minateva. That God didn't just say out of the blue. That's not the way God works in this view of things. That God comes and says, do this, do that, go in, go out. Here we have a much more interactive view of the human being and God. That the human being has desires and fears, and they work against each other, and sometimes they end up in a real mess, and sometimes they can end up in an ambivalent reverie, in a dream that allows many things to come to the surface. And here, God wouldn't say, leave the ark, if he didn't connect with something in the human being that wants to leave. Even if mostly the human being is afraid of coming out, of release, and there are good reasons to be afraid. Okay. Nevertheless, there has to be that other impulse, and get me out of here. When can one say that? What does it mean to have God recognizing that? The human being recognizes, right? It works both ways. It's not just an anthropomorphic way of talking about God. That God says to the human being, leave the ark. You know, that God controls the human being here. He comes and he says, time to go out of the ark. There is a dynamic going on here. Something is working here under the soil. Something implicitly in Noach wants to get out of here. And he can perhaps just begin to utter the words. It's not clear whether he really has said the words or not. But God responds to it by bringing the words out and saying, say. What is it that Noach really wants? It's not just to get out of the ark. It's to get out of the ark on a different level. That means lehodot et shemcha. That Noach wants to discover words again. He wants to discover the words of thanks, for instance. That impulse that we call gratitude, that we are able to say thank you for something. We wouldn't know anything about it if there had not been desire, if there had not been actually suffering, deprivation, some measure of deprivation. What does it take for us to say thank you with great feeling? We don't say it when it's a routine moment. Pass the salt, thank you. We say thank you when someone is reaching into your heart and knows what you are lacking. When you are lacking something, and then we say thank you. And we're doing much more than just thanking, right? We're thinking, right? We're thanking for the power to think. I think Heidegger talks about this. Danken and denken. In German also you have that play. The human being has been, there's one part of it that just wants to curl up into a little ball and not extend himself in the world at all. But there's another part that wants the opposite, that wants to open up. And when that impulse is in some way recognized from the outside, inside, outside, then one thanks. There's a movement of gratitude. That movement of gratitude is what makes us human. It's connected with a movement of desire. It's connected with everything that allows us not just to accept the reality, to use reverie and dream, to combine water and earth, to get one's hands into the paste, le pat. Gaston Bachelard, perhaps I'll finish with him, a French philosopher who wrote about the psychoanalysis of the elements with which we live. Psychoanalysis of fire, water and dreams, earth, light, everything that we regard as the chemical elements of our lives, everything has a dream associated with it. That human beings dream fire or dream water. What is it to dream water? Is to dream something that will come and soften the hard material. If it goes too far, we're afraid of it. It can decompose everything. It can destroy everything. We want to have it in just the right way to contain the desire and the fear that we feel about water, right? The flood on the one hand and the creative medium, so that we can get our hands deep into that and express the ambivalence. The ambivalence about water, for instance, can be fully expressed. It can be expressed in the actual movement of the hands, or it can be expressed through words, through the creation of a poem, or the creation of a shiur. It can be addressed through other means of creativity. And God needs this as human beings need this. Right? We look to God in a way as a model. Right? That's how it's presented here. What does it mean to be B'Tselem Elokim? It's something that is not actually given right away. It's an ultimate aim. It's a desire. When we are aware of that desire, that we want to be creative as God is creative, right? If it's that desire, right, to create something, then we have a possibility of moving away from the brute material reality, without being swept away entirely in a world of fantasy, in a world of wish, and finding that space, what Winnicott called potential space. Perhaps I'll finish with something I read a long time ago, and I looked it up again because I found it such an extraordinary image of what I'm trying to express here. Matisse, the French artist, French painter Matisse, there was a film made of him painting. You know, we're going back to the latter half of the 19th century. A film was made of his painting, the brush strokes. And then it was shown to him slowed down. The film was slowed down, so he could watch the brush strokes in slow detail. And what he became aware of then, that what looks consciously, on the conscious level, like decisive brush strokes, breaks down when you slow the film down into the brush hovering in the air, dancing in the air, before it finally decides to land on the canvas. And that space in the air, Matisse apparently was very moved when he saw this film, because it made him aware of what he knew, of course, in his depths. And that is the ambivalence, the undecidedness, the sense of many things to be held in mind at the same time. How I don't want to put the brush down in the wrong place. I don't sense somewhere of a complexity that I have to find a way of expressing. On this, the French philosopher Merleau-Ponty commented that this was the film, the idea of this gives us a sense of the space of possibilities, the space between the here and now of me painting, right, the actual reality, me using paint on canvas, and the other reality, which has to do with an image, with an idea that has to emerge from the block of marble. Yeah, an idea, that was Michelangelo's idea, that somewhere there is an angel hiding in the material. And how do you bridge the gap? And that's the space between the actual material you're using, the objective material, and the dream. And somewhere the need to keep on playing, right? Play work, to keep on playing with this material with all its power to frustrate us. You know, that we'll do it many times wrong for every time we do it right, maybe. You know, there's no denying it. And only we know, right? Only we really know all the itzavon that's contained in this. And yet without that itzavon, without that capacity to be disappointed, we wouldn't have the desire. We wouldn't have the desire, and the desire is everything. Thank you very much. Do we have time perhaps for one question? Would someone like to take courage and either ask a question or make a comment? I know it's embarrassing when someone does that, but.
So can I say something?
Please, yes, I'm just trying to.
So I feel like you repainted Parshas Noach, or the flood story, as a description of the struggle. If we say that Bereshis was creating, God created.
Yes.
So Noach is the struggle of creativity. It's not a one-time thing.
Yes. It's the ongoing, reliable struggle. You know, that's what keeps us going. That's why we get up in the morning. It's not a one-time thing. It's again, I have to do it. I have to try to do it. So we begin to develop our own intimate resources of Tzelem Elokim, of what it means from the inside out to aspire to what's called the image of God. Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much. And thank you for putting on your cameras. And I hope I'll see you next week.
Thank you so much.
All the best.
Thank you, Avivah, and thank you everyone for
Thank
joining
you very
us.
much.
There's one more week of free trial classes, and then afterwards, everyone needs to sign up. So if you haven't signed up yet, please go to the website and sign up. If you have any issues, you can email us or call the office, and someone will be happy to help you.
תודה רבה, תודה רבה. Thank you very much. Very interesting. Thank you. Shalom. Shabbat shalom.
So well presented, easy to follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
תודה רבה.
תודה רבה.
תודה רבה.